Buenas tardes, bienvenidos a la Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez y a esta transmisión en conjunto con EMOL TV. Soy Ernesto Ayala, director de vinculación con el medio de la universidad. Hoy conversaremos con el ensayista, historiador de las ideas, Mark Lilla, en el segundo encuentro del ciclo que hemos denominado Conversaciones sobre Nuestro Tiempo. Esta conversación se transmitirá en castellano por EMOL TV y en idioma original en la home de la Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez, uai.cl. La intención de estas conversaciones es tener un espacio para reflexionar sobre los tiempos que corren, muchas veces rápidos, confusos y desorientadores. El fin es tratar de entender mejor qué pone hoy en tensión la democracia, la cultura y los acuerdos sobre los que se basa nuestra vida en común. Mark Lilla, doctorado en Harvard, profesor de humanidades de la Universidad de Columbia, colaborador de medios como del New York Times y del New York Review of Books, es el autor de numerosos ensayos. A lo largo de su carrera, si ella pudiera resumirse muy brevemente, ha abordado las ideas y debates intelectuales que han dado forma a la civilización occidental tal como la conocemos hoy. Su libro más difundido y quizás más polémico, El regreso liberal, The Once and Future Liberal, del año 2017, sin embargo, no proviene de su trabajo académico, sino más bien de una frustración política, con el Partido Demócrata del que se siente parte o cercano. Esta frustración nace al ver cómo este partido había perdido contacto con sus votantes al estar enfocado en las necesidades y demandas de la política de identidades, en lugar de convocar detrás de un proyecto común, amplio y abierto a una ciudadanía sin apellidos. Lo interesante es que pese a que el regreso liberal tiene un claro foco en la política de Estados Unidos, sus observaciones se han mostrado de gran universalidad, ya que las tensiones entre la demanda por una política tribal y las demandas de una política pensada para ciudadanos sin apellidos se presentan cada vez con más fuerza en distintas partes del mundo y, por cierto, comienza a estar presente en Chile. El profesor Lilla es también uno de los precursores detrás de la carta firmada por 150 escritores en contra de la censura producida por la cultura de la cancelación, carta publicada el año pasado en la revista Harper's. Sobre ello, imagino, también hablaremos hoy. Esta tarde, el profesor Lilla conversará con Isabel Aninat, decana de la Facultad de Derecho de la Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez, y el escritor Arturo Fontaine, Senior Fellow y director de la Cátedra Edmund Burke de la universidad. Antes de empezar, quizá una última aclaración quizás necesaria. La palabra liberal en Estados Unidos tiene una connotación distinta que en el resto de Occidente. En Estados Unidos, liberal describe a una persona de centroizquierda, socialdemócrata o progresista, con todos los matices que puede haber en ese espectro. En Chile y el resto de Occidente, la palabra liberal es más amplia, más cercana al liberalismo clásico y puede ser reconocida como propia por personas tanto de izquierda como de derecha. Bueno, dicha esa aclaración, le quiero dar la bienvenida al profesor Lilla. Muchas gracias por estar con nosotros y le dejo la palabra.
Okay, thank you, Ernesto.
Muchas gracias, Ernesto. Y gracias por la invitación. Ojalá tengamos una buena conversación hoy día. Vamos a contarle a la audiencia que Ernesto me pidió hablar sobre mi libro un poco, así es que les voy a dar un poco un antecedente de comentarios que vamos a hacer hoy día. Espero que no se centre esto en Estados Unidos. Creo que la experiencia de Estados Unidos tiene una aplicación más universal hoy día de lo que se habría pensado cuando escribimos el libro. Vamos a comenzar por eso, entonces. Escribí The Once and Future Liberal después de la victoria de Donald Trump, inesperada respecto de Hillary Clinton. Y en la semana siguiente se escribió un artículo para el New York Times que fue el artículo más leído, el artículo político del año, y generó muchos comentarios, muchos de ellos negativos. Y más que responder al hecho que había ganado Trump y que había perdido Clinton, tratando de buscar las causas de las estrategias políticas recientes, traté de ponerlo en una perspectiva histórica. La idea es que esta noción, en la política de Estados Unidos, y quizás también en otros países, creo que así es, han habido distintas dispensas. Es un término que viene de la teología, la dispensa. Cada dispensa es un principio organizativo respecto de las ideas y acciones de las personas. Hay dos dispensas en la política de Estados Unidos en el siglo XX. La de Roosevelt, que se tradujo en el triunfo de un nuevo tipo de liberalismo, el que acaba de escribir Ernesto, surgió durante la Depresión y que ofrece un nuevo sentido no solo de ciudadanía política, sino que de ciudadanía social. La idea de los años de Roosevelt y de esta coalición del 30 y del 40 era que no se puede ejercer la ciudadanía política si uno no está conectado con la sociedad o la economía. En el resto del mundo se habla de esto en términos de democracia social. Pero esto es un cambio en el liberalismo de Estados Unidos. Entonces, se establece un nuevo principio. Un principio que también se aplica durante la Segunda Guerra en Estados Unidos, que es que los ciudadanos de Estados Unidos se deben cosas entre sí. No son solo un conjunto de personas dentro de una frontera, sino que se dice que debe haber solidaridad entre ciudadanos y la legitimidad de un gobierno activo para poder satisfacer las necesidades colectivas del país. Y esta dispensa general define la política de Estados Unidos en la década del 30 hasta la década del 80, en términos más generales, no solamente el Partido Demócrata o los liberales, sino que es un marco en el que incluso la derecha moderada tenía que funcionar con su propia visión de lo que es del programa social que debe existir. Bueno, esto se disuelve en la década del 80 con la elección de Reagan. Venía a la baja en todo caso. La razón de aquello son muchas, tienen que ver con la falla del Estado benefactor, programas que se implementaron pero que no alcanzaron sus objetivos, la pobreza crecía, el gobierno ya no era la respuesta a las preguntas importantes. Se planteó un individualismo que es la generación del yo en la década del 70. Los jóvenes estaban menos conectados con los temas sociales más amplios, estaban más centrados en sí mismos. También esta idea en la derecha dos ideas. Una, que tiene derechos económicos que no puede fijar el gobierno, pero lo más importante, que si el mercado podía operar, de hecho, mucho de los problemas sociales que enfrentábamos, de hecho, iban a mejorar y no iban a empeorar. Por lo tanto, la noción de aquello era que en el caso de Reagan había otra forma de alcanzar los objetivos en comparación con los años de Roosevelt. De manera que dos principios distintos. Uno, el gobierno no debería tener la parte económica. Y segundo, era que la sociedad en sí, las organizaciones, la sociedad civil, como se llamó, también sería una red para que las personas fuesen educadas y fuesen protegidas. Esta idea afectó no solo al Partido Republicano hasta el 2017, sino que también al demócrata. Tanto Obama como Clinton funcionaron dentro de esta visión de Reagan de la política. Bueno, en 2016 quedó claro que estas dos visiones del país, estos dos conjuntos de principios, habían colapsado y que estaban agotados por varias razones. Se imaginarán algunas de ellas. Las consecuencias económicas de la globalización, también el colapso económico de 2008, etc. Pero también hay otros cambios culturales, especialmente, de los que vamos a hablar en un momento, en Estados Unidos. Pero se hizo evidente en algún momento que no solo no había una nueva visión sobre el derecho republicano, sino que en la izquierda democrática, durante los años de Reagan, no se había preparado una alternativa, ni en la derecha ni en la izquierda. No había una visión nueva o un principio organizador, una nueva dispensa que se pudiese ofrecer como alternativa a la visión de Reagan. Entonces se produce un vacío en la política en Estados Unidos. Y en este vacío entra Donald Trump. Esta situación, creo, el tipo de situación, era evidente en una serie de países occidentales avanzados en la última década, la caída de los partidos más importantes, el surgimiento del populismo. Los partidos más importantes ya no tenían una visión clara del país, de manera que parecía que eso estaba muy diseminado en Occidente y en Estados Unidos. Trump, el demagogo clásico, eso no tiene nada de nuevo dentro de la historia de la demagogia. Es otro más, es uno más. Pero lo nuevo, y lo que sí es más interesante en el caso de Trump, es lo que le pasa al
Democratic Party. What happened to them? Where were they? Now that a vacuum had been created and they couldn't defeat someone like Trump. Well, it turned out that the left had been transformed during the Reagan years, that the economic libertarianism on the right was matched by a kind of cultural libertarianism on the left. And there were demands for new individual rights in culture and demands as well of particular identity groups. The question of one's personal identity became paramount. There was a shift from political strategy centered on parties and instead focused on movements and demonstrations, and I would say even political theater. And so there was a new sort of disorganized, atomized left that could not offer an alternative to the American public. Now, let me say that the claims of the various identity groups that became vocal and indeed dominant on the left were entirely justified for minorities, for gays, and for other groups. However, what such a focus failed to do was to incorporate portions of a larger majority of Americans who were largely white, middle class, and working class, religious, and patriotic. And so within our politics, a cultural gap opened up so that we not only had a political politics, so to speak, with different visions of the economy and government, but two competing visions of culture. And this culture war is now what defines American politics. It had really begun in the 1990s, but has come back and is really dominating everything that goes on in the country now. And identity politics is wrapped up with all of this. And what it's led to is a redefinition on the American left of what it is. That is no longer primarily concerned with seizing political power and governing, but rather is intent on working cultural transformations within the institutions that it controls, which are not the political institutions. At the moment, not only in the national government, the Biden election meant that the Democrats barely control Washington, barely. But at the state and local level of governments, which are very important in the United States, the right is completely dominant. While on the other hand, the cultural left is completely dominant in the areas of education, of entertainment, of publishing, of the press, advertising, the legal profession. All of these things are dominated by people on the left, and not just any left, but a privileged upper middle class left. And so it's as if the right and left in this country now are fighting, in a sense, different wars, or rather there are two wars, and in one the left is dominant, and in the other the right is dominant. But because of this, it's impossible for either force to kind of capture the country and develop a vision. And so this helps to explain the confusion and the aimlessness, and also the intensity of the hatreds right now in American politics. And it's out of this that you get, on the cultural side, what we call canceling here, and I assume there's a Spanish equivalent. We can expand on that during the question period, but it has become omnipresent in American society right now. It mainly consists of online attacks on those who are seen to have impermissible views on identity politics, on other, especially racial politics and sexual politics. And pressure is being put on employers. Professors feel intimidated and silenced, so do students, and fellow employees in businesses do. There's also a more significant effort to erase from historical memory those in the past who are now thought not to hold the correct views by our lights today, and they don't. But it has meant the tearing down of monuments, which one can debate when it's wise, when it's not wise, but more significantly, it is leading to the rewriting of American history and the teaching of a new American history that, in a sense, has been cleaned up morally to denounce anyone in the past thought to be not politically correct in our moment, and to move to the front people in the past who may not have been seen so significant at the time, but are seen to be significant by our lights today. All right. So two events illustrate pretty obviously where this has all led us in the United States. One is, of course, the storming of the US Capitol last January. And the other were the mass demonstrations following the murder of the African-American man, George Floyd, by a policeman in Minnesota last summer. I think it's been my view, and I think it's by now kind of confirmed, that the Floyd demonstrations will prove to be far more historically significant than the attacks on the US Capitol. And let me try to explain why. First, let me say that the demonstrations have changed my views about somewhat that I expressed in the book. And in particular, about the capacity of identity politics to mobilize people who don't belong to those identity groups necessarily. And I've also seen some of the good in identity politics that was not evident to me before. All right, two things are striking, I think. One is that the demonstrations that were based on identity claims drew in hundreds of thousands of non-African Americans and mobilized them on streets across the country. From one angle, this could be seen as just, well, people came out in order to protest an injustice and wanted to protect fellow citizens, and one needn't interpret it in terms of race. But in fact, it has led to a real crisis of conscience in white America, educated white America, about the status of African Americans, about the distinctiveness of Black history and experience, and about the significance of Black identity as opposed to the racial or ethnic identities of other groups. So something is changing, and it's changing very fast. It seems that white Americans are learning something, and more importantly, seem willing to learn something. There's been a rush from all quarters to make Black experience more central to our cultural conversation, in particular in education. The notion of affirmative action, which in the United States means that there's an effort to try to recruit minorities who might not otherwise be hired or might not have the same paper qualifications in order to increase the representation and build a Black middle class. Well, this principle is now being applied to everything in American life. American television and movies have changed radically, and theater have changed radically over the past year. That suddenly it seems simply either in bad taste or questionable to have a television show or a movie that does not have significant Black characters. And in fact, the Motion Picture Association in Los Angeles that gives out the Oscars has said it will no longer consider movies for the Best Picture award that do not have significant Black representation. One sees it in advertising. Suddenly, the most common face one sees in American advertising is a Black face. Now, the impulse behind that is mainly good, that here are people who haven't appeared in American commercials despite their significance. And not just in so-called typically Black situations, but just going through life, needing to buy a car, trying to buy a house, things like that. It's a very good change. But it is also reflective of a kind of panic on the side of corporate America that feels that it needs to show its good faith in these efforts so that it won't get canceled. And so there's a real mix of motives here, some of them very good and others just cowardly. So that's one striking thing. The other striking thing for me, and I hope we get to talk about it in the discussion that follows, is that the George Floyd murder led to significant demonstrations around the world. I don't think anyone would have expected that. It was not just in countries that had experience with colonialism in Africa or themselves were colonized, or even just in countries that had significant minority populations. As you know very well, there were these demonstrations in many South American countries, but there also were demonstrations in India, in Japan, in New Zealand, in Sri Lanka, in Taiwan, in Turkey, in Armenia, and even in Kazakhstan. This is a very puzzling development and seems to me to be significant. Now, many of these demonstrations were just opportunities to protest against police brutality in these different countries, or as a way of protesting against the brutality of the government. But I think it also reflects a growing identity consciousness around the globe, especially among young people. That young people around the world are taking identity issues more seriously. That this has come to define their cultural politics. I realized a short while ago that the most recognizable flag in the world today, after the American flag, is the rainbow flag of the LGBT movement. There is hardly a square kilometer on this earth where people do not recognize what that flag means. That too seems to be an extremely significant development in world politics and world culture. This does not have to do simply with Americanization, I think, because these things are happening sort of spontaneously. And one can't just blame the United States. These things wouldn't catch fire in all these places, in Kazakhstan, if there were not some reasons within each of these societies that young people are identifying themselves with identity politics. And there are three changes, and perhaps more, at least three changes that this reflects, I think. One, I think, is simply the individualism that comes along with the modern economy, modern capitalism, and neoliberal politics. That young people are simply more prone not to think of themselves as part of a class or as members of a political party, but to think of themselves as individuals defining themselves in terms of their personal identities and their political identities. The second is the globalization of cultural symbols instantaneously by social media. That when something appears in one country as a symbol, it will appear tomorrow in countless other countries. Third thing, and this is where I'll stop, is, I think, a globalization, or maybe I should call it a re-globalization of ideological conflict in world politics. Now, transnational political struggles are not new. I mean, one can go back to the wars of religion in 16th century Europe, where one sees two competing ideologies, religious ideologies, that are maintained by networks across many countries, doing battle with each other. So there were Catholic forces and Catholic ideologues in many countries that were bound together, and they were fighting against Protestants who were doing the same thing. And of course, as we know, the 20th century was all about transnational politics, the global ideologies of socialism and communism and fascism and liberal democracy. Well, I think that one thing we haven't remarked much is how this global aspect of ideological conflict ended in 1989. That there was no framework for transnational ideological conflict after those battles over communism and socialism ended. And so one might have expected politics to revert to the national level and all of the struggles being local in nations. Instead, I think what we're seeing, and here I'm speculating about the future, is that global ideological conflict is being reconstituted right now. That on the right, you have conditions that are similar in many countries where you have an uneducated, economically disadvantaged class in the new economy, and people who have often a traditional view about culture, that is, about family and about religion. Opposed to them is another new global class of elites and entrepreneurs who have their own networks and ideas. And on the right, these transnational networks are becoming the networks among populists certainly between the United States, Europe, New Zealand, Australia, there are now transnational networks of people on the radical right who are talking to each other all the time. And on the internet, one is also seeing, I think, the development of a global identity politics network among young people who consider this to be the new political frontier. And so this disconnect between political politics and cultural politics is being seen elsewhere, so that there's a political struggle that the right seems to be winning in many places, and a cultural struggle that the left seems to be winning in many places. And this, I think, is where we should be looking for new developments in world politics today. Where will this take us? Of course, no one knows. What is striking, though, to me, is that as in the 20th century, these two new ideological formations are both hostile to liberalism. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, profesor Lilla. Hay mucho que conversar, veo. Varios avances. Vamos a empezar con Isabel Aninat, decana de la Escuela de Derecho de la Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez. Va a ser la primera pregunta y luego seguirá Arturo Fontaine. Isabel.
Muchas gracias, Ernesto. Muchas gracias, profesor Lilla, por su reflexión. Es interesante, sobre todo que va más allá del libro que comentaba, ya ha planteado algunas interrogantes que muestran la globalización que ha tenido el fenómeno. Y quiero quedarme en un punto ahí. Porque usted, profesor, se ha referido, ¿no es cierto?, a tres posibles causas o factores que han incidido en esta globalización. Y yo quisiera preguntar además si hay una cuarta cuestión, y que tiene que ver con el decaimiento, en algunos lugares crisis también, del concepto de democracia representativa. Porque es un fenómeno que se observa, por supuesto, en América Latina, pero también, ¿no es cierto?, en países de Europa con mucha intensidad, y que tiene que ver con este cuestionamiento a las instituciones propias o más clásicas del liberalismo, y especialmente el concepto de representación política. Entonces, usted hablaba de esta distancia que se genera, y quizás un lugar donde por naturaleza se encuentran estas distintas posiciones políticas y concepciones, sobre todo ideológicas, es en una institución como el Parlamento o el Congreso, y pareciera ser que es la institución más desprestigiada, independientemente del país en el que uno se encuentre, al menos en el mundo occidental, ¿no es cierto? Entonces, ¿cree que también esta discusión sobre el tipo de democracia, la intención de incluir mayor mecanismos de participación directa o de democracia directa, influye en esta quizás distancia entre los ámbitos culturales y, por supuesto, en esta idea de una representación identitaria con mucho más fuerza?
Yeah, no, thank you for that. That's something I haven't considered in these remarks. It's something that I've thought about separately, but I haven't put together with these thoughts here. There are many causes of the decay of our representative institutions and their decreasing legitimacy in the eyes of the public. But I think what's crucial to representative democracy is not individual participation. That what is crucial is party participation. That government becomes legitimized when a particular party has a vision of what it wants to do. That vision is attractive to a majority in the country, and then that party is able to enact laws to reach those ends. But it's the decay of our political parties and the ideologies behind them that I think is the crucial missing link here. When I look at the parties of right and left in Europe today, I don't know Latin America well, but certainly in Europe, it's very difficult to discern what differences there are. And that's for a couple of reasons. One is that our political parties are really legacies from the 19th century. On the left, they come from the legacy of socialist thought. And on the right, I would say, liberal thought in the European and South American sense, and neoliberalism. And those grand ideological traditions are exhausted. And so it looks as if the parties are not only indistinguishable, they're driven simply by people with personal motivation. They seem unable to reach the social problems we have today. And partly that's because they don't have a program. But one of the reasons they don't have a program is we are simply in a new political situation with globalization around the world. And we're facing problems that, frankly, no one has the answer to. And when no one has even a plausible answer to the problems facing us, it's not surprising that representative democracy will start to decay.
Gracias, profesor. Arturo Fontaine.
Muy buenas tardes, muchas gracias. Muchas gracias, Ernesto, por la invitación. Un gusto estar contigo, Isabel. Y un verdadero privilegio tener la oportunidad, profesor Lilla, de oírlo y verlo, pero además de verlo dando pasos nuevos, entrando en un terreno distinto de lo que ha publicado y planteando el efecto político que tiene o puede tener las políticas de la identidad en la forma que acabamos de oír. El efecto no solo en Estados Unidos, sino en el mundo entero. Me parece muy interesante ese punto y la idea de que hay una victoria, por lo menos en el campo de la cultura, de las políticas de identidad. En ese sentido, me gustaría llevarlo a ese brillante ensayo suyo que se llama Sobre la indiferencia, publicado en el año 2020, un ensayo hecho en la tradición de Tocqueville, donde hace una crítica de la política y de la identidad en el mundo cultural, y en especial en el mundo literario. Usted llega a decir que los comités que dan los premios prefieren juzgar las características físicas y la historia personal de los escritores que juzgar la calidad estética de sus obras como tales. Y luego hace un alcance acerca de la naturaleza de las obras literarias. Y esto último en particular, como novelista, me interesa mucho. Me interesa su visión de la literatura. Cito sus palabras en el libro. La literatura, dice usted, y las artes no son sostén de la larga marcha hacia la redención nacional. Nada tienen que ver con darle voz o contar nuestras historias o celebrar los logros de alguien o de algún grupo. Esto es confundir el arte con la promoción publicitaria. La contribución de la literatura y del arte a la moralidad es, dice usted, indirecta. Su poder es recordarnos de la verdad, que es que somos un misterio para nosotros mismos, como dijo San Agustín, que lo dijo por ahí en las Confesiones. Mi pregunta sería invitarlo a desarrollar un poco esta idea de la literatura, el cine, las artes en relación al misterio que somos y por qué las políticas de identidad podrían amenazar el ejercicio de las artes y de la cultura.
Yes, thank you very much. I'd like to mention that the essay appeared in translation in Letras Libres, and so it's available in Spanish. So I urge you not only to read it there, but to subscribe to that excellent magazine. Yes, well, the essay is motivated at first by a concern about what happens in American society when the autonomy of the arts comes under attack. Ours is a very democratic, is two things. One, a very democratic country in the small d sense of democratic, that is suspicious of things that seem too elevated that everyone can't share. And the other, we are an evangelical country. Those of the listeners who know American history know that it's often common to talk about the various great awakenings in American history. And these were periods when there was an upsurge of evangelical religious fervor with meetings across the country, mass conversions, and attempts to make our society more religious and more conservative. What is happening in our time, I think, is that those evangelical energies in a secular setting are being now put into our politics. And so what you're seeing in the identity politics era is, on the one hand, a desire to proselytize for various identity groups, and to proselytize for a particular view of politics on the one hand. And the other motivation, quite frankly, is for Americans to avoid the difficult problem of art. Art makes Americans uncomfortable. More generally, pleasure makes Americans uncomfortable. Whether it's the pleasure of the arts, the pleasure of eating, the pleasures of sex, it makes us uncomfortable because we can't take a moral stand on it. It threatens to break down moral categories. And so what's happening in our moment, I think, is these two things are coming together. And the enemies of the autonomy of art now have a tremendous weapon, which is to demand that the arts genuflect before the political idols of the moment. And if they don't, they will be canceled. And so the question I pose in the essay was, well, what does one do in the face of that? First, one has to, in a sense, call out or identify what is going on here. When one reads, for example, literary prizes at the moment in the United States have become meaningless because the prime directive for the committees that give these things is to make sure not only that minority and sexual minority groups are represented, but that they be promoted, that the job is to promote, as you said in the quotation from my piece, people who are telling their stories. And literature begins when you take a story and turn it into art. The notion that art would be not be concerned with moral uplift, of course it has all sorts of indirect moral effects, becomes very suspect at the moment, because it simply appears that you're defending the privileges of highly educated whites and men who have whose voices, in their view, have been most heard. Now, it's one thing to say that there are all sorts of excellent writers out there who we ought to read because they're devoted to their art as art. But that's not the case that is being made. These books should be read, and our children should be taught these books because of the moral political uplift that they bring. And so it's a very bad moment right now for us. And that's why in this essay, I counsel a kind of indifference and a withdrawal, a kind of cultural monasticism until this storm has passed.
Muy bien, estoy de acuerdo. ¿Qué puedo decir? Isabel, tiene...
El profesor habló de religión, para quienes no lo conocen, tienen un muy buen libro que aprovecho de recomendar sobre religión y política. Y quiero aprovechar un poco la reflexión que hizo a partir de la pregunta sobre las artes, para también mostrar que el fenómeno, un poco lo que hablábamos antes, también se ha expandido más allá de las diferencias en la aproximación de la diversidad, ¿no es cierto? El tratamiento del pluralismo y de la diversidad es un desafío que los países han abordado de manera muy distintas, y para poner algunos ejemplos, en Estados Unidos se habla de este American Melting Pot, pero países como Canadá tienen un sistema o una aproximación muy diversa de qué significa la diversidad y cómo se trata el multiculturalismo, y está el caso de Quebec al interior de Canadá, y luego tenemos otro modelo muy distinto que es el francés, menos puritano, pero basado en una idea de republicanismo, ¿no es cierto? Y entonces quizás la pregunta es, ¿por qué o cómo estas distintas ideas de multiculturalismo y del tratamiento político de la diversidad de alguna manera se sigue o no termina o sigue estando marcado por una crisis cultural que puede ser más o menos aguda, o el caso del American Melting Pot en el caso de Estados Unidos, por las distintas consideraciones que usted ya ha mencionado, es quizás el epítome de un tema que está hoy día pero que nos permanecerá. ¿Cree usted que el modelo de tratamiento de la diferencia marca definitivamente la manera de la política identitaria?
Yeah, well, certainly the question of social diversity is a crucial one in our time, especially with the great movements of people. So as a social phenomenon, that has all sorts of political implications. However, once you have a more diverse population, one thing so at the social level, there are different ways to cope with this. And you were talking about these different models of assimilation as opposed to allowing more autonomy, cultural autonomy, all sorts of models of how to think about the society. When it comes to governing the society politically, that diversity can become a barrier to developing a governing majority, since democracy is not about representation. Democracy is about governing. It is about instituting programs. And we want people to be represented in that process, but in order to govern, not simply as an end in itself. And so multiculturalism, which is a fact, not an ideal, it's just a fact, poses all sorts of political challenges. On the cultural side, on the other hand, what's interesting is that multiculturalism opens incredible new possibilities, right, for discovering literatures and arts and the history of all sorts of other countries and civilizations in the present and in the past. So it's an extraordinary time, in a sense, to be alive right now when all of these things are becoming part of common discussion. The paradox in the American situation, and it's not the case in other countries, is that Americans are very, very provincial. And so if I look at the book review section of a newspaper in Spanish or Italian or in French, a good number of the books being reviewed are in translation. That is not the case in the United States, right? So what do Americans mean when they talk about multiculturalism in culture and in the arts? What they mean is not that we have things to learn from the rest of the world that might challenge our views of democracy and our views of our fundamental values, but rather we need to interpret the rest of the world as if it were America. And so the literature of other countries are explored in order to find stories that fit into the new multicultural identity vision. Nothing that would challenge that, even though there are countries and civilizations that are extremely not only hostile to it, but also offer alternatives. Americans are not comfortable considering alternatives to democracy, alternatives to capitalism. And so they look in world literature and world art for comforting stories. And because the American market is so important in literature and the arts, foreign writers and foreign artists have adapted what they do for the American market. And so, in fact, one sees so-called world literature is very homogenous because everyone is trying to write the world literature novel instead of writing the novel of where they are coming from. And one last thing about diversity is what's very striking about the young people today is their lack of diversity. No matter where they live right now, they all walk around like this with their phones. They all listen to the same music. They're all picking up the same political cues about identity, about sexuality, about race. Never have young people been more similar, I think, in world history than right now. But all they talk about is diversity. And so diversity has become a sort of empty signifier, or maybe that's not the way to describe it, but it has become a kind of ghost because it is not reflective of the increasing homogenization of world culture, especially among the young.
Profesor, pero ¿no será al revés? ¿No será que precisamente porque hay una homogeneidad tan grande, sobre todo en la juventud de todas partes del mundo, que como usted bien describe, se visten igual, andan con los mismos teléfonos, ven el mismo tipo de cine, ven el mismo tipo de consumo cultural, de usos, de productos, y esa homogeneidad que es la globalización de estilos de vida? ¿No será que eso mismo produce la necesidad de buscar marcas identitarias y pertenencias de grupos? Porque precisamente estamos en un mundo que de otra manera es muy anónimo, porque estos movimientos identitarios son grupos, de alguna manera son grupos lastimados, hablan desde una herida, ¿no? Expresan una cierta queja que muchísimas veces es sumamente justificada, pero se busca el reconocimiento de una colectividad, de una identidad colectiva de algún modo amenazada o castigada. Y ese reconocimiento por parte de los demás es una búsqueda, es vista y vivida, y es una búsqueda de dignidad. Y eso parece como consustancial al mundo de nuestro tiempo, y parece como parte de la globalización, como que la globalización incluyera estas necesidades de pertenencias colectivas, también globales, de un modo más intenso que en otras épocas donde había tanta diferencia, por ejemplo, entre un país y otro. En otras palabras, ¿cree usted que esta política de identidad tiene alguna posibilidad de agotarse en nuestro tiempo, o es más bien algo con lo cual tenemos que contar, que es parte de nuestro mundo y hay que buscar un modo de que esto se incorpore bien a la democracia representativa y permita el buen gobierno, pero no es algo que podamos pretender que se vaya a superar o a dejar de lado.
Yeah. I don't know how to answer that question because it's a question I posed to myself, but I'm interested in your remarks leading up to the question because no one has yet tried to plumb the psychology of identity consciousness today, especially among the young. That is, plumb the psychology of it in an impartial way, because there are many paradoxes in it. One of them is that young people, and all of us, but especially young people, feel more and more isolated from their families, their countries. There's a kind of anomie that they experience. Everything moves very quickly. We live in these liquid societies. How do you define yourself in this sort of situation? And so, in a sense, you need to invent for yourself, out of nothing, a conception of your identity that will give you some solidity and give you some, a kind of compass for going through life. This is the way I see it. And so the identity politics has these two sides. On the one hand, it's very much about the individual. But on the other hand, it's actually a search for belonging to these larger groups, which I think is what you were getting at.
Yeah, that's right.
And no one has plumbed that. It would be for an artist to plumb that, actually. I don't think a professional psychologist. But it would be very interesting to try to capture this new mindset and the dark, and often the suffering that's behind it, So I think you now have a task, not just me, but you have a task now.
Quería comentar que ahora nos vamos a ir a uai.cl porque EMOL tiene otros compromisos, pues vamos a seguir la conversación en UAI. Para los que nos estén viendo en EMOL, se ponen al home de la Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez, uai.cl. Yo quería hacerle una pregunta, si la Isabel me permite, al profesor Lilla. Respecto a los relatos, a las grandes narrativas que hay detrás de Once and Future Liberal, usted, quizás por su formación como historiador de la idea, logra dar cuenta de manera muy nítida de las dos grandes narrativas que movieron la política norteamericana de Estados Unidos durante el siglo XX y principios y hasta 2016, como bien dice. Esta narrativa, mi pregunta es si usted ha pensado cómo estas narrativas se cristalizan, porque yo no me niego a creer que solo fue el talento de Roosevelt o el talento de Reagan que fueron capaces de crear estas grandes visiones, estas grandes narrativas. Yo me imagino que hay hechos sociales, culturales que van tejiéndose hasta que de repente existe o llega un momento que hay un político o un grupo político que logra como crear la narrativa, como agruparla y darle una fuerza y marcar los siguientes 50 años. Ahora yo veo que existe un vacío, como bien decía usted, de narrativa, y eso explicaba parte del problema de la democracia representativa, probablemente. Entonces, y tenemos la política de identidades que parece preeminente y parece que tomara el total de la acción política, el total del escenario. En ese sentido, ¿cómo ve usted una salida o cómo se crea una salida alternativa o qué elementos tendrían que entrar en juego para crear un sentido político que vaya más allá, que sea más amplio, que vaya más allá de las identidades o de la búsqueda de la rival de las identidades? Es una tarea que yo sé que es grande, pero ¿por dónde habría que comenzar, quizá?
Yeah, well, one doesn't begin by setting out to do just that. That these dispensations arise, as you say, out of a number of factors. And though it's interesting, I think we tend to underestimate the role of individuals in this, individual leaders. There's a prejudice, a deformation, professional deformation in the social sciences to always look for social causes and to downplay the role of particular individuals. Reagan as an individual was significant. Without Reagan, a lot of this would not have happened. And the same with Roosevelt. It's not as if social forces create an individual. It requires an encounter of, a man with a moment, as they would say, right? But all one does, if one looks at the history of these things, for instance, the Roosevelt dispensation, that came out of a lot of intellectual labor at the beginning of the 20th century among the so-called American progressives, where they were thinking about social policy, they were thinking about the nature of democracy. And so what happens, I think there's several factors that come together. One is there's some kind of change in society. And finally, people who have been doing intellectual labor for a long time suddenly find themselves in a position to where they can develop ideas that bear some relation to that new situation, or at least that people feel it, and that that all happens at the same time that an individual, a catalytic individual, whether a Reagan or a Trump, can suddenly make something happen. So, for example, Reaganism did not just develop in 1980, as you said. Certainly, there were social forces and all in the economy, and also government actions and their consequences. But also, neoconservatism, and here I talk about neoconservatism not in terms of foreign policy, but in terms of domestic policy and politics in the United States. There was 15 years where a little magazine by the name of The Public Interest, which actually I edited for a while in the 1980s, was a kind of laboratory for new ideas about how to address social problems without the use of government. And out of that developed a network of think tanks and summer institutes, and a whole intellectual network, a subculture developed so that when Reagan was elected in 1980, this sort of hidden shadow government of thinkers immediately moved in and delivered a political program to Reagan. It was quite literally a book. It was put together by a foundation called the Heritage Foundation, where all these ideas had been floating around for 15 years, were put into policy papers and given to the government, and those who were appointed started doing these things. That's an unusual situation. But it's not as if one sets out to do this. All one can do is do one's labor, and that's to try to address the present situation, try to make one's way one step at a time, and hope for the best.
Thank you, Professor. Isabel.
Yo quería volver un poco atrás porque Arturo, ¿no es cierto?, y hablaba de esta soledad que se puede sentir en este mundo tan globalizado, ¿no es cierto?, y cómo quizás estos grupos identitarios son una respuesta a ello. Y la pregunta es si no era anteriormente que esos grupos se encontraban en los partidos políticos. Voy a volver hacia atrás, ¿no es cierto? Y si justamente lo que conversábamos al principio de este intercambio, ¿cuál es el rol de los partidos políticos? Si son los partidos políticos los que de alguna manera se han desentendido de los nuevos fenómenos sociales, y entonces parece que esa búsqueda de un proyecto colectivo y de una idea de construcción de país hay que buscarla entonces en otros grupos. Especialmente lo digo en el caso de Estados Unidos, en que me parece que todo esto además está muy marcado por el gerrymandering y el efecto que eso ha producido en los dos partidos de buscar políticas, ¿no es cierto?, muy identificadas con ciertos electores específicos.
Yes, I'm not sure what the question is in that. What is the
question?
No,
si cree que al igual como lo vemos en Chile, entre un distanciamiento de los partidos con nuevos fenómenos sociales, lo que hablábamos al principio de la conversación, el Partido Demócrata y el Partido Republicano también, al verse separados de los nuevos fenómenos sociales, han de alguna manera, la gente ha buscado su representación en estos otros grupos y cuánto influye el mismo sistema electoral en ello. Porque los partidos están muy marcados por el sistema electoral que los gobierna. En el caso de Estados Unidos, nuevamente el gerrymandering.
Yes, yes. I mean, I think if I understand what you're saying, there's been a kind of migration of activity from the political parties into other social movements or other organizations that allow people to be represented and get things done. I recognize that. The problem is that government happens. Every year, someone sets the taxes. Every year, someone runs the army and decides whether soldiers are going to be drafted or not, whether you'll go to war. Government happens. And if your aim in politics is simply representation and you leave the political process, you will leave it to others to govern. Politics is about governing, period. And so what worries me about this migration that you point to is that while it may be satisfying in certain ways, it doesn't begin to address the decisive role of government. And so my wish is that all of these energies be put into developing new political parties and developing new ideas, but with a focus on the political system and focus on seizing power. I mean, back in the 60s and 70s, everyone was talking about seizing power, whether through the electoral system or through violence. It was about political power. And this migration away from it has not been good for democracy, and it certainly hasn't been good for the left.
Pero, perdón que interrumpa en esto, pero ¿cuánto de eso ha sido porque se ha movido hacia una tendencia de usar mucho más las cortes y menos, ¿no es cierto?, el debate en el Parlamento? El caso del aborto, el caso de matrimonio igualitario, estoy poniendo casos que han sido decididos por la Corte Suprema en Estados Unidos más que en el Congreso.
Yes, no, that's the crucial link, because the one way in which identity groups in the United States can directly affect government action is through the courts. But the courts are not representative institutions, and not every political issue is an issue of right. Rather, many of these issues are ones of negotiation, of trading off one thing against another. It requires deliberation. All those things should be happening in parliaments and in the Senate of the United States. But the juridification of our politics goes hand in hand with this conception of politics as being movement politics and identity politics. And it is not good for our democracies.
Arturo.
Mark, una de las diversas críticas que tú planteas a la política de identidad, que a mí me dejó pensando, una de las que más me afectó a mí es una que la pones más o menos así en tu libro. Estamos en una sala de clases y la conversación empieza debiera empezar de esta manera. Creo en A y este es mi argumento. En lugar de eso, debido a la política de identidad, la discusión toma otra modalidad. Dices tú, hablando como X, me ofende que tú digas B. Esto tiene sentido, dices, si crees que la identidad determina todo. Esto significa que no existe un espacio imparcial para el diálogo, ¿no? Los hombres blancos poseen una cierta epistemología, las mujeres negras otra, etc. Entonces, ¿qué se puede decir? Reina el tabú. Estoy parafraseando más o menos lo que tú dices. Es decir, en otras palabras, tu tesis es que si alguien habla desde su identidad, ya no valen razones, la cuestión es moral, mi identidad, posiblemente mi identidad como víctima, es suficiente y eso me da a priori la razón moral. Pero por otra parte, afirmas tú que los estudiantes en estos mismos campus, en esta misma lucha cultural, se les está enseñando que la identidad no existe, que la identidad de género no es algo fijo, que todo es infinitamente maleable. Este sería, dices tú, el enfoque francés. Supongo que te estás refiriendo a Foucault. Pero si es así, si las identidades son fluidas, son constructos, son cambiantes, son maleables, como piensa Foucault, no es forzoso que esas identidades se planteen desde una identidad moral. O sea, debiera ser más bien lo contrario. Entonces, lo que destruye el piso común para la discusión no es tanto la cuestión de la identidad como tal, pareciera, sino que plantear la deliberación como un choque entre identidades morales fijas, inamovibles, donde uno es y será la víctima y se le adjudica al otro, al interlocutor, ¿no es cierto?, la identidad fija e imborrable del victimario. Entonces, puesto en otros términos, no me juzgues por mis razones y actos, sino que júzgame por quien yo soy. Ese sería el argumento. Yo soy un alma bella y tú no. Parecería que es más bien esa la actitud que bloquea el diálogo, más que el hecho de una identidad escogida, asumida y revisable. ¿Cómo ves tú esto?
Yes, well, you summarized my argument very well. That has been my argument. The thing I'd like to focus on what you said, though, is this. If I understood you, it's something I've thought a bit about. Is this paradox that that in the ideologies of surrounding identity today, there's often a shift from treating identity as something given and something that cannot be changed, and therefore should be respected for that reason, or an identity is something I've chosen, and therefore it should be respected because my choices should be respected. But just what identity is gets lost in the game of playing one argument sometimes and one argument the other time. For example, in the debates, on the one hand, young people will argue and they'll read Foucault, but especially Judith Butler, who I assume is well translated into Spanish, that gender is not sex and that gender is malleable. Okay, so that leaves me with the idea that I can, in her words, perform gender any way I like. And any way I like to, you must respect. Okay, I understand that. But on the other hand, there are arguments that I need to physically transition from one gender to another because my true gender is different from the one I was assigned at birth. Well, there, the argument is I've got a true gender there that was given to me. That is why I'm uncomfortable in my body. That is why I need to transition, or I need to dress differently. I need to be addressed differently. And that argument can make sense. What doesn't make sense is the two arguments together.
Exactamente.
Right?
Esa es la paradoja.
Yeah, and yes, exactly. And but it's politically expedient to have both of these arguments available depending on the situation. But when when I talk to students about this, they don't see the paradox until you point it out, and then it's clear they haven't thought about it, right? And I'm not trying to, undo their views or anything like that, but it's a genuine question given these debates. And so, but it's a more general problem with identity politics because, for example, let's say you come from a Jewish family. You will often hear young Jewish people say, well, I've decided not to identify myself as a Jew for various reasons, as if that's a choice. Whereas in other situations, someone else might say, I didn't choose this, and I must be respected because of that, but also because I've not chosen this, and it's just a fact about me. I have certain obligations, and I have certain obligations to the Jewish community and Jewish life and the diaspora or whatever, right? But if you're just choosing things, you don't bear any responsibilities. But if you're rooted in something, you do. And there's not a great thirst for assuming responsibility today.
Cierto. Creo que tenemos momento como para una o dos preguntas más. No sé, Isabel, sí.
No, muy corto, porque el libro fue escrito, ¿no es cierto?, dirigido al Partido Demócrata, como establece en el libro, o a la progresismo estadounidense. Es difícil de traducir exactamente los términos, ¿no es cierto? Justo en la elección Hillary-Donald Trump, y de alguna manera hoy día el Partido Demócrata se encuentra en una situación muy distinta a la que se encontraba en ese momento, y la campaña electoral del actual presidente Biden también fue distinta, pero no del todo en estos términos, ¿no es cierto? Entonces la pregunta quizás es, ¿cómo juega este libro hoy? Si se volviera a escribir, ¿es la realidad del Partido Demócrata tan marcada en estos términos como lo estaba al momento de escribir este libro? ¿O se notan ciertos cambios de tendencia en su interior?
No. I'm glad you asked that. I want to talk about that. Let me preface my remarks by saying something that foreign observers often find difficult to believe, and that is that the American president is not a powerful person. That power is so dispersed among institutions in the United States, between the president, Congress, and in Congress there are two houses that have different roles, and the courts, and then the governors of the states and the legislatures of the states, and then local government. So when one talks about the state of a political party and its fortunes, one has to take into account the party at all those levels. And the president is not, as in some other systems, the head of the party. The head of the party is usually someone assigned just to do the business. Rather, our parties are structured now that they are simply, as they used to say in French politics, they're just elephants in the room. And each of those elephants wants to become president next. So there are various campaigns wanting to start. And then one of them gets elected, but he does not have a mandate to govern and determine things within his own party, let alone in the government. All that preface in order to say that the election of Joe Biden is insignificant for this story. That first, just intrinsically, because everything has to change, but also because the Democrats, despite Trump, was not able to gain a majority in both houses of, it has a slim majority in the Senate that is inoperative because of various rules. So we cannot, the Democratic Party cannot institute whatever it wants through those rules. At the state and local government, the Republican parties control far more states, control the governorships, control the legislatures, and a lot of the work gets done there, even when it comes to implementing national political policy. So Biden is not terribly strong in his party, nor is he strong in the system of government today. So there are a lot of hopes being expressed, and a lot of journalists are making their, doing their jobs by saying there's been some transformation within the party. It's a break in American history. It's not any of those things. Instead, what has started is a civil war within the party. And the war within the party is not really between two ideological positions. It's really between those who want to do culture politics and those who mainly, or defined by that, or believe in movement politics, and those who believe in party politics and capturing as much of a majority as you can in order to capture national government. And so the left of the party right now has no strategy for regaining national power at the national level. There are various things that it wants, and it behaves as if it's still involved in movement politics. And if we just fight hard enough for these things, we'll get them. Well, you won't if you don't have a majority. And so I think of them, if they'll forgive me, as the children in the room, while the grown-ups in the party, the grown-ups in the room, are concerned about how do we, over the next generation, build a party that will have a broad base so we can govern for a long time. And that's the fight in the party right now. And I have no idea. No one knows how that will turn out. I'm not optimistic.
Arturo, ¿tiene algo último o lo dejamos?
Sí, le puedo, no sé cuánto rato nos queda, pero
yo quiero usar del profesor Lilla, le dije que hasta las 7:30, digamos, a estar.
Pero siguiendo, digamos, con el planteamiento que acaba de hacer, ¿hasta qué punto esta situación está vinculada a un hecho inédito, que es que posiblemente por la primera vez vamos a tener hasta hoy, vamos a tener una potencia mundial como Estados Unidos, que realmente es una sociedad multirracial y que lo va a hacer en las próximas décadas, tal vez desde la élite para abajo? O sea, a mí me parece que ese tema racial está muy por debajo, muy subyacente en lo que se está viviendo en Estados Unidos, visto desde fuera, claro, en el sentido de que el trumpismo, por ejemplo, está muy vinculado visto desde fuera, a una cierta sensación como de raza acosada, ¿no? Blancos, trabajadores, protestantes, o por lo menos tradicionales, que por primera vez en la historia ven que realmente esa América, que ha sido la columna vertebral de la nación, ya no va a ser más esa columna vertebral, y que ahora hay una multitud de razas, y Estados Unidos, entonces, como digo, por primera vez es una sociedad multirracial, que es un experimento nuevo. ¿Cómo reaccionas a ese comentario, Mark?
Yes. And you put your finger on the important part of that. The percent of the American population that is African American hasn't changed in many decades. It's been about 13 or 14% for a long time. There are not more Black Americans than there were 20 or 30 years ago. The growing population is Latino and Asian, and the declining population is whites. What has changed especially for African Americans, is that as through affirmative action and efforts, as they have risen socially into institutions of power in the economy, in government, in cultural institutions, we have a new self-conscious Black voice that we now have to listen to and take into account and talk with and argue with, and that's the way it's supposed to work. That's a very good thing, right? So I'm not worried about that. There is this false notion that all non-white minorities somehow share a situation. They're called people of color or POCs or POCs. And so Sri Lankans and Blacks, Memkomba, it's the same battle, when it's not. I mean, the important first story is the condition of African Americans, and after that, Latinos, and after that, Asians, I would say. But yes, so now you have people in these groups that are holding positions of power, and they have a voice, and they ought to. I don't see a problem coming from that side so much. I mean, people are excited right now. The problem comes with the white consciousness among a declining white population and a kind of nativism. To a large extent, not entirely, but to a large extent, this has been caused or provoked, not caused, but provoked by the focus on whiteness among minority groups and identity politics, people who practice identity politics, who have made certainly lower class, less educated whites more self-conscious, bothered, and self-assertive. And that, I think, is a big social and political challenge for us right now. There's nothing comparable among the minority groups now. There's a kind of rage and a reassertion of a kind of open racism that one hasn't seen in a long time. And so both socially and politically, I am worried about that.
Profesor Lilla, Isabel, Arturo, les quiero dar las gracias por esta conversación y ojalá que nos podamos encontrar en un futuro próximo. Muchas gracias, profesor.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Thanks to you all.
Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias.